Welcome back to Boiler Wild. My name is Eric Johnson. On this podcast, talk about boiler industry topics as well as personal development. I got a good technical one for you today. This is going to be a topic that a lot of people know about, but if you are new or if you are a owner operator, you may have not seen this done. If you have never had a new boiler, what I'm going to talk about is how to boil out a boiler. What is boil out? And some other things that you need to know and why it's important. But first things first, thank you to everybody who's rated this podcast 5 stars. That really helps this podcast get found and helps the podcast platforms know that there are listeners. So if you haven't rated the podcast, please take a moment right now to rate the podcast 5 stars. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to me. I greatly appreciate that. And if you want to leave a comment too, there's some comments on Spotify. I think you can comment on Apple Podcasts as well. Leave a comment too. And if you write a question in your comment, I will reply to it. Or you can DM me on LinkedIn or email me, eric.johnson@boilerin.com. All right, enough of that. Let's get into it. Right to it. How to boil out a boiler. First of all, why would we boil out a boiler? What is boil out? Boil out procedure is something that you need to do every time you have a new steam boiler and every time, well, I wouldn't say every time, but most times that you retube a boiler or do a major repair on a boiler. So let's talk about the new steam boiler. So a new steam boiler is going to be welded together and put together, depending on whether it's a fire tube boiler or a water tube boiler. It is going to be put together with brand new metal, and on a fire tube boiler, you're going to roll a shell, weld it on the tube sheets, and then put in all the tubes. Water tube boiler, you'll have a steam drum, you'll have a mud drum, and then you will form all the tubes. They'll all be bent for whatever the boiler design is, and they will get attached to the steam drum and the mud drum, however the design is. So why is boil out important? So when you have that new boiler, it ships from the factory, and you may think, well, brand new boiler, it's clean and everything. Well, it's kind of clean, yes. But when you buy metal, when you are putting metal together, when you are rolling tubes, you are depositing some grease, you are depositing oil onto the metal, and the metal has oils on it from just manufacturing, shipping. It also helps it protect from like surface rust and everything. And the manufacturer typically does not remove that oil. What you would have to do is take acetone and wipe down every tube, or if it's a water tube boiler, you would have to like brush through every tube. But a lot of bending is done with a little bit of oil or everything, and that will get on the inside of the tube. And now you'll have a little bit of oil in your boiler. And you say, Eric, what's the big deal? What is a little bit of oil? So if you ever had a little bit of oil spill in your driveway and then it's rained, you may know that it looks like a rainbow and the oil is floating on top of the water. Or if you are cooking and you put some water into a pot and then you put some oil into the pot as well, you'll pour the oil in and you'll notice the oil doesn't disperse, but it kind of just floats right on the top. That is because oil and water do not mix together. So if you pour like a Gatorade and water together, they're going to mix together, and essentially the water is going to become the color of the Gatorade because they are of similar substances. However, water and oil essentially repel each other, and oil will end up floating on the top. And that is why when you have a oil spill in the Gulf of America, you end up getting giant oil slicks that are floating around the Gulf that inhibit the wildlife, block out the sun, cause all the environmental damage. And that oil just floats on the top of the water and just goes everywhere. And that is how they do a lot of the cleaning, is they skim the top of the water to remove the oil from the water. So you have your brand new boiler and your customer may not be aware of what the startup is. This is part of startup, a boil out, And you may not be doing the boil out. Sometimes a chemical company will be doing the boil out if you are the startup company, sometimes not. Me personally, I've always done the boil out. They are not difficult, but they can be done wrong. But I wouldn't say there's one right way to do it, but there's definitely a wrong way to do it, if that makes sense. I will explain that. So oil and water do not mix. That is the important thing, and oil floats to the top. So how does that impact steam productions? Let's just think about a fire tube boiler. Everybody hopefully knows what a fire tube boiler kind of looks like in their head. And you have a normal operating water level that is going to be 4 to 5 inches above the tubes. And go back to what I said about oil floats on the top. So all that oil that is on the tubes, that is on the shell steel that the manufacturer that boiler with, that is all going to either stick to the tubes or it is going to eventually get scrubbed off the tubes and then float to the top of the water level. And if you were to pop open the manway of the boiler after you fill the brand new boiler, you would see rainbow on top of the water. And that rainbow is oil. And it's going to be a very, very thin layer. It's not like there's gallons and gallons and gallons of oil, unless the boiler manufacturer did something wrong, but there shouldn't be gallons and gallons of oil. It's just going to be a little thin layer. However, that thin layer can cause chaos. And if you do not do a boil out, you typically can see a thin layer of oil in the sight glass, the water sight glass or the gauge glass that is coming off the water column. And you will see just like a little thin layer of something that doesn't look like water. It'll be a little bit darker, and then it'll get washed up on the sides of the glass if you have a tubular glass, and then it'll eventually come down, and it'll always just be right on top of the water. So how does that impact steam production? When you make steam, you have heat, and the heat is going through the tubes, and the water that is directly in contact with the tubes and with the furnace is the large tube. It is also called a Morrison tube. Technically, a Morrison tube is only a furnace, which is what the burner fires in. The large tube, the boiler fires in. The Morrison tube, some guy's last name Morrison, but he invented that furnace to be corrugated, and corrugated has humps in it. Cleaver books typically will use a corrugated furnace. I think all boiler manufacturers will use them. There's benefits and drawbacks to corrugated furnaces, but the point is that you have a furnace and you have tubes, and the water will boil right at where the heat is. It doesn't just boil magically in the middle between tubes. It'll boil where the hottest parts are, which is the surface contact of the metal, and then the water continually cycles or circulates through the boiler internally. So the water boils and turns into steam, so you get little steam bubbles. And that steam bubble, if you can imagine, you have a tube surface, and you have water sitting against the outside of that tube surface in a fire tube boiler, and that water turns into a steam bubble, and that bubble rises up through the rest of the water until it reaches the top of the water level. That bubble, that steam bubble, will break through that top of the water level and enter the steam space of the boiler. And steam is a gas, and it will be part of that steam space. And if it is allowed to, if you have the valves open, and if there is a pressure differential, the steam will flow out of the boiler. Going back to how it moves out of the water. So I want to highlight that the steam bubble rises up through the water, and it will come through or break through the water level. If you've seen a pond or you've gone to a small lake or something and you go to the edge of the water, or even you can do this with a glass of water, there will be surface tension. You can see surface tension. And if you go to a pond, you can see bugs walking along the top of the water. If you slowly were to drop a penny on top of water, you can get a penny to float on top of water just because of the surface tension. So water has tension on the surface. That is a high school physics lesson. But the oil will increase that surface tension, and it creates this layer. And what increasing the surface tension does is it allows that steam bubble to pick up water and bring water with it. So you just have this little tiny thin layer of oil, and all these steam bubbles are rapidly rising through this water that is in the boiler and breaking through the level of the boiler. And when you have a layer of oil, that level increases with tension right on that layer, and now you pick up the water. And if you have a very mild boil, the water in the sight glass may be it'll just bounce a little bit, and you maybe get a little wet steam. But if you're maybe in high fire and you're rapidly boiling a lot of water, the water level will pick up, and you'll see in the sight glass the water level just bouncing up and down, up and down. And what will happen is you'll eventually get it to bounce so much that it'll trip the primary low water cutoff, and the boiler will cycle, and obviously it will turn off. Well, hopefully it'll turn off, but it'll turn off, and then it'll immediately restart again because the boiling will slow down. It'll understand that it does have a normal water level, and it'll restart. And this cycle will continually repeat. You cannot boil off or just try to out steam oil in a boiler. I have seen people try to do it. They try to skip the boil out step on a boiler startup, and the oil just stays in the boiler. And you can't drain the boiler. You can't fill the boiler up with water and then drain it, because the oil, as the water level drops down in the boiler, the oil just clings to the metal surfaces. Oil is going to have that tension, and it clings to the metal surfaces, and you'll drain all the water out of the boiler, and you'll be like, well, we washed it out. Nope, the oil is still stuck to the metal surfaces. If you work in the garage, or, hopefully if you work in the boiler room where you've gotten oil on your hands, sometimes you need a soap like Dawn dish soap in order to remove the oil, and it's not just water, because a oil-based substance such as just machine oil that is used for the machining of steel and all that stuff, cutting oil, that is oil-based versus what you would typically wash your hands with, which is just water. And that is why when you use special types of soap, just such as like Dawn dish soap, and this will also be applicable when you are cooking oily foods, if you just wash your pots and pans with water, you'll kind of spread the oil around. You'll get the major food crumbs off the pots and pans, but you won't really get the oil off, and it'll just seem like you're just kind of moving a mess around. And then you'll just put a little bit of dish soap in, and the dish soap helps to scrub off or remove the oil because of essentially how the chemistry of dish soap is. And that's why you use dish soap instead of just hot water when you are doing your dishes. Side note, don't let your dishes pile up in your sink. Don't be a trash human. You should always stay on top of that. Anyways, back to it. So boil out, same thing with a water tube boiler. You have a steam drum, and you'll be having the normal operating water level in the steam drum, and all the oil from the tubes will be rising up out of the tubes, and it'll be in the steam drum. Well, if you were to drain the boiler, all the water would go out of the boiler, but then all the oil would get stuck to the sides of the steam drum and to the sides of the tubes of the inside of the tube, since it is a water tube boiler, and you will not be able to clean out the oil. So how do you clean out the oil? It is a procedure called boil out. And once again, I don't say there is a right way to do boil out, but there is definitely a wrong way. The number one wrong way to do a boil out is a time-based boil out, where, and I've seen it, where a manager, maybe your project manager, or even a customer, if you were doing a boil out and they say, oh, do the boil out and do this for 2 hours, and then that should be good. No, that is wrong. You don't know how much oil is inside the boiler, and you have to check. Boil out and a washout procedure of the boiler is a results-based procedure. It is not a time-based procedure. So if somebody says a boil out should only take 4 hours, that is a estimate of what they have experienced, and it also based on the size of the boiler, and if the boiler manufacturer wiped down tubes before they installed the tubes. There's a lot of variables to it, but never ever say, oh, well, it took more than 4 hours, so you did the boil out wrong. Boil out is results based, not time based. Very, very important. And if you skimp on the boil out and you just do a partial job, you will probably have problems, and you'll eventually just have to redo the boil out. So it's best to just do it right the first time, as with everything. Always do it right the first time. So how do you do a boil out? So there's different procedures. I believe ABMA has a procedure. Some boiler manufacturers, I think Superior Boiler, just puts right in their manual the ABMA boil out procedure. I don't know who wrote that procedure for ABMA. I'm looking at a boil out procedure from Johnston Boiler that's right on their website. They are all typically the same. Once again, there's no right way to do a boil out, but there's definitely wrong ways to do a boil out. Every procedure from the manufacturer will be slightly different. If you have a boiler from a manufacturer, always look at the procedure for that manufacturer, but I wouldn't say that you would have to use that exact procedure versus another procedure, because they're all going to be mostly the same. And the goal of every single procedure is to get the oil out of the boiler. So how do you do that? One, you need to isolate the boiler from the system. So you're going to have the header valved off and you're going to have all the drain valves closed. You are going to remove the safety valves. I have seen people do boil out by not removing the safety valves. I've seen people do boil out with removing the safety valves. The safety valves are typically, depending on how the boiler is built, one of the top parts of the boiler. And going back to what I said, oil floats on top of water. So the only way to get rid of it, or to know that we're like flowing it out of the boiler, is to take it off the top of the water. And how do you do that? Is to flood the boiler out of a top part of the boiler. So I'm not saying that you have to take the safety valves off, but it is recommended. It also is recommended to take the safety valves off so you don't get oil under the valves and under the seats. I will admit I have done boil outs where I have not taken off the safety valves. I've seen other people not take off the safety valves. Sometimes taking off the safety valves is a huge pain depending on how people pipe them. Sometimes pipe fitters will pipe safety valves and not put unions or flanges on the outlets of them. So essentially you have to cut everything and you would have to repipe it. And I understand that the world is not perfect, and you as a startup technician kind of just have to make do. So there's other ways to do it. You can find another plug. It all depends on the make and model of the boiler. Just talk to your boiler manufacturer if you are not sure on their procedure, and if they don't put their procedure in the manual, or if you want to have a recommendation for that exact boiler model. So remove the safety valves, and this is also going to be your vent. So we don't want to build pressure when we are doing a boil out. All we are doing is getting a rolling boil. And a rolling boil is just going to be a slow, gentle boil. We're not going to be building pressure. And that slow, gentle boil is just going to be bringing up the water to 212 degrees. And it'll just, all that boiling action will be removing the oil from the metal surfaces and making it float to the top. And then as it's floating to the top and sitting there, then as we drain it out of that top of the surface of the boiler, we will be getting rid of the oil to drain. So you're going to then, after you remove the safety valves or other opening on top of the boiler, you're going to fill the boiler with clean water, and then you're going to put in the boil out compound. There are chemicals that are specifically for boil out. I have heard of people using Tide. I don't know if I would recommend that, but I guess in a pinch you can use Tide. Tide removes oil from your clothes. It also removes oil from whatever it's put on. Tide is a detergent, just like your Dawn dish soap is a detergent. I would always use a boil out chemical that is meant for a boiler. And you also need to check if you have a site that is really specific about what is on site, what are the chemicals, what is going down a drain, especially if they have a wastewater plant. You want to be bringing in an SDS with the chemical, and you want to be telling them what you are flowing to drain so that they can be aware of that, and to make sure that their wastewater is aware of that. Once again, it's not going to be a ton of oil. It's not just gallons and gallons of oil. It's just going to be a thin film, and most of the water that is going to be wasted is just going to be straight water, but you have to waste a lot of water in order to get the oil out of the boiler. So you're going to add your boil out compound. Ask your chemical provider if you don't know what to use. I'm sure they will have a recommendation. If not, talk to your boiler manufacturer. You're going to start the boiler, and this is a big one. If you have a brand new boiler, a lot of owners think startup is you walk in, you flip the on switch, and the boiler fires. If you've ever done a startup, that is probably not the case. With a steam boiler, there is a little bit more going on versus a hydronic boiler, and you got to make sure that the gas pressure is correct, that everything is wired correctly. A lot of packaged boilers, even though that they're a packaged boiler, are not 100% wired. So they may not be 100% wired between the boiler and the burner, or you may have external wiring between the feed water pump and the burner, or the feed water pump and the low water cutoff, depending on your boiler setup. There's a lot of field setup, and unfortunately, also manufacturers make mistakes, and you got to fix wiring mistakes from manufacturers, because most manufacturers will just light off and do a test fire, but then they'll unwire, or they won't have the boiler 100% set up in their factory. They just make sure that everything works, but it doesn't exactly ship the same way that they're testing it. They're just testing function versus everything is 100% wired correctly. All the relays are wired correctly and everything, because I have found some mistakes that are like, how is this possible? Also, if you read the manual, every manufacturer will say, due to shipping and vibration, all the wires, you got to check them all. I have not seen a wire come loose due to vibration from shipping. I've seen wires not even tightened, and that is a little bit concerning, but it happens. I understand there's humans on the manufacturer side, and those humans are also making mistakes. So anyways, start the boiler, and you're going to make sure that combustion is good on low fire. You don't have to have a huge curve in. All you got to do is have low fire done. And once you have low fire done and the combustion's clean, you're just going to lock the burner in low fire. Hopefully you're using some kind of parallel positioning system. If you are using linkage, hopefully the manual auto switch is there. If not, you can always unwire the mod motor so that the mod motor does not modulate up. If your boiler for some reason doesn't have a auto manual and a potentiometer, or you can have your own potentiometer. I would highly recommend that if you work on a lot of linkage boilers, or if you work on any linkage boilers, have your own potentiometer, and you can always modulate the Honeywell module 4 motor however you want. But since the boiler and burner are new, hopefully everything works, and it came with all the options it should. Once you have the boiler warmed up, you're going to slowly warm it up, obviously, because you're going to be sitting on low fire. You're not going to take it past low fire. And the boiler will be open to atmosphere through the safety valve openings, because we remove the safety valves, or whatever other opening you use. Just make sure that you are using a good opening. You can't just use any opening in the boiler. When in doubt, ask your boiler manufacturer if you're not sure. If you haven't already, you're going to fill up the boiler past the normal operating water level. So you're going to have to put the pump in manual, or you're going to have to open a bypass line on your feed water valve, and you're going to slowly increase the level of the boiler, but you don't want to fill the boiler all the way up to the tapping because you have cold water in the boiler, and as that water heats up, it's going to expand. So it's always easier to add water than it is to drain water, but if you add too much water, you can always drain it out. You just have to watch your safety valve tapping. And the tapping, you are going to, I forgot to say this, you're going to have a pipe or a hose. And by hose, I mean a hose that can handle 250-degree water. A hose, and that is not a garden hose. Your average garden hose will just melt. But you'll typically have a pipe or a high temperature hose that is coming off the tapping or tappings, and that will allow you to observe the water that is coming out of the boiler that is overflowing out of the boiler. And as the boiler is heating up and as the water expands in volume, you don't want any water coming out of the boiler yet. So make sure that you keep the level down below the surface, right under the tapping of wherever you're going to be overflowing the boiler. Once the burner has ran long enough on low fire, the water will eventually begin to boil. Once again, we are not making steam pressure, and the boiler is going to be open to atmosphere. The water is going to start to boil, and then it's going to develop a steady discharge of steam coming out of the safety valve tapping or whatever tapping that you're using. So then you're going to turn the boiler off. We're not going to try to keep making more steam pressure. If you keep running the boiler, you are going to get a violent discharge of steam out of that opening. We are not trying to do that. We are just trying to get a rolling boil in the boiler. Once you have steam coming out, that is plenty. Shut off the boiler or shut off the burner. And then you're going to wait till the steady steam supply that is coming out of that tapping is going to be just a lower volume. And then you are going to restart the boiler, and you're going to do that process over and over and over again. Now, once you have cycled the burner a little bit, you can then start filling up the boiler a little bit higher in the water level and start overflowing water out of the discharge of the safety valve opening. This is going to have to be piped to drain. This is going to be a decent amount of water, but it is not going to be a ton of water. You don't want your feed water valve open all the way, and you're going to go back and forth between turning on the burner and keeping it just a rolling boil and just a very small steam supply coming out of the boiler. So once it starts making more steam, you turn off the burner, and then the boil will slow down. But as you are overflowing and discharging water out of the opening to waste, you can check. I typically would like to run it into some kind of canister or some kind of way that you are going to be able to check what the water looks like. If you shine your light into the water, you will be able to see the oil slick and the rainbow that is on top of the oil surface. And you are going to keep doing this until you have no more rainbow slick coming out of the boiler. Some other boil out procedures will tell you to not overflow, and they will tell you to just cycle the boiler a couple times and then drain it and then fill it, drain it, fill, drain. You can also do that. There's really, once again, no correct way. I would prefer the overflow way. It is more reliable. Make sure that you get everything, and as you overflow the boiler, you're constantly cleaning out and you're removing that oil. You also have to be aware that you are not melting your drain, so that water that is coming out is going to be over 200 degrees, and it needs to be going down to your blowdown separator. Also, you need to make sure that there's no issues with your drain where you can't be dumping out that water that has a little bit of oil in it and everything. So always make sure that that is not going to be an issue. But once you have no oil overflowing, or once you have, if you don't want to overflow the water out of the safety valve discharge, you can drain the boiler all the way, and then you're going to fill it, and then you're going to drain it, and then you're going to fill it, and then drain it, and then you're going to open up the boiler, and you're going to look at in the handholds and manways and inspect the water side. You may have to run a hose through the water side and spray out the water side. And you're going to be looking for any signs of oil, any signs of garbage in there. Make sure that there's no tools left in there. I've found tools in brand new boilers that have been left in the bottom of it. So make sure you are checking your boiler. If you have a water tube boiler, make sure you're checking the steam drum and the mud drum. And you're just going to repeat that cycle. Whatever boil out procedure you want to use, whatever your company wants to do, you're going to repeat it until you don't have oil. And once again, you cannot cut out this process. You cannot say good enough. You have to get all the oil out or you are going to have issues. Your water level is going to be bouncing and it is going to cause carryover, and carryover causes erratic water level, and it causes water to be leaving with the steam, and your rest of the startup is going to be inhibited by a bouncing water level in the boiler, and you are going to have issues, and you end up just going to have to be doing the boil out again. So always make sure you have more than enough boil out chemical than you need. Don't calculate the exact amount and only bring that. You always want to have a little bit more to make sure that you are able to clean the boiler if you have to refill and boil out the boiler twice. After you inspected it, you may still have oil. That is not uncommon. It is not uncommon for, say, like a 200 to 500 horsepower boiler to take all day to boil out. The whole process of boiling out a boiler is basically hurry up and wait. First, you got to make sure you can get a fire in the boiler, which is harder than it seems sometimes. With a brand new boiler, you would think you'd be able to flip on the switch, but no. Once you have a fire, great, but you're locked in low fire, and the initial warm up of the boiler is going to be super slow. That's going to take a while, and all the water in the boiler is probably going to be 50 to 70 degrees. So it's going to take a little bit. And then draining and filling, depending on the water supply in your feed water tank or DA tank. There's all these factors that add in hours and hours and hours of time. And to do it right, just plan on a whole day for boil out, minimum. It may take 2 days. Larger boilers, especially water tube boilers, may have more oil in them, and you will need to take more time. Once again, boil out is not a time-based procedure. It is a results-based procedure. And the results is no oil left on the water side of the surface of the boiler, because we need clean water and no oil to interfere with our water surface tension for making steam. So once the boiler is clean, you're going to put in all the manways and handholds. Some people will replace the gaskets. Most boiler manufacturers will say replace the gaskets. I typically only replace the gaskets if I have to. I think if the boiler is brand new, you can reuse the gasket, but that's up to you. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Please let me know, but that's what I've done in the past, and it's worked fine. The gasket is brand new from the manufacturer. The boiler's maybe been fired once. It can be resealed unless the gasket is somehow damaged, but they look brand new, and I don't have any oil contamination or any contamination with the boil out compound of the gasket surfaces. If you use a boil out compound, or if you use a different gasket for your manways and handholds that the boil out compound makes swell or whatever, then you would have to replace them. When in doubt, replace them. Seal up the boiler, obviously put the safety valves back on, and you're all good to go. You can continue your startup. Obviously refill the boiler. You don't want to leave the boiler empty. Once you've gotten the inside wet, you don't want to leave the boiler empty. You also don't want to leave the water untreated. So you want to be getting some water treatment in there. Even if you're just doing a startup, you want to be getting water treatment in there, because if you fill the boiler with untreated water and the boiler sits there, you are now causing corrosion in your brand new boiler. So you don't want to leave it empty. You always want to keep it filled. Otherwise, you're going to have to do a dry layup if you are leaving it empty, but keep it filled with water. You want to prevent rusting and flash rust inside the water side of the boiler. So question, we've been talking about steam boilers here. Do you have to boil out a hot water boiler? I've done it before, and there's manufacturers that say you do. And this is going to be a hot water boiler that is going to be a typical fire tube or water tube hot water boiler. This is not going to be a high efficiency hot water boiler. There's going to be a stainless steel heat exchanger and everything. You don't have to boil those out. But if you were to buy a Scotch Marine boiler and you ordered a hot water Scotch Marine boiler, you can say that you can boil it out. Typically, people maybe will just fill and flush them. It is not a huge deal to have oil inside of your boiler because the oil, you're not making steam, and the oil is just going to be mixed through the system, and it's not going to really inhibit the heat exchange surfaces of the system and of the boiler, since a hot water boiler is 100% filled with water. Can you? Yes. Should you make sure that the boiler is not full of junk water? Like if you fill the boiler and you drain it and there's orange water coming out or brown water coming out, you should probably flush the boiler and make sure it's clean before you open up to the system. I have done boil outs on hot water boilers to flush them out, to clean them out. It's not, I didn't spend as much time as I did on a steam boiler, but I still did it. But also, if you go to do it and the contractor has opened up the valves to the boiler and they're flowing water to the boiler, there's no sense in doing it, because whatever debris and oils in the boiler has already been flushed into the system. If they've done that, and you can just skip the boil out at that point, unless there's other issues or other things that you need to look at. Another thing you need to keep in mind. So we talked about a brand new boiler. What about when we retube a boiler? So when you retube a boiler, sometimes the people retubing it, whether it's a boiler maker or whoever, they will wipe down all the tubes with acetone or another detergent so that you don't have to boil out the boiler, or that you have a very minor boil out. But a lot of times they don't. So if you were to do a full retube on a boiler, typically you're going to have to do a boil out. It's not going to be as extensive as a brand new boiler, since the shell is going to be old steel. But if you are replacing a bunch of tubes on a boiler, plan on a boil out. If you are replacing a bunch of water tubes on a water tube boiler, plan on a boil out. That is just a safe thing to plan. Always be checking the inside of your boiler as you fill it up to see if there's a rainbow slick of oil on the surface, because if you do, you need to boil out your boiler. You can't just ignore it, because that oil will cause issues with the water level of your boiler, as I stated previously. Another thing you need to keep in mind when you have a brand new system is, or even with a old system, is all the oil in the piping and debris of the brand new system. Maybe you welded the system together, or you threaded the system, parts of the steam system together. There's debris and oil in it, and you want to dump all your condensate. You don't want to be bringing all that water and oil back into your feed water tank or DA tank and then pumping it back into the boiler, because if you just pump oil back into the boiler, that oil is going to get trapped there and you are going to have water level issues. So typically, if you are connecting to a brand new system, you're going to waste the water for about a week or two, depending on how dirty the system is. If you have a brand new boiler and have an existing system, I've seen people waste water for up to 2 weeks to make sure that all the loops have turned on and that all the loops are flushed just in case. You'll know what I mean if you have a brand new feed water tank or DA tank and a boiler, and you spend time cleaning the boiler, doing everything proper, and then you heat everything up and you make steam, and all of a sudden your feed water tank in the sight glass turns brown, and you'll be like, man, this is a brand new boiler and feed water tank. Why is it brown? And then you remember that you connected to an old system and that you were listening to the Boiler Wild podcast, and that you were supposed to be able to waste condensate. And that is an issue as well when you are installing that you want to look for, is the ability to waste condensate, because another thing during the life cycle of the boiler system is if the chemical provider or water treatment company screws up the chemicals, and I have seen this done and I've done it before, not that I screwed up the chemicals, but I fixed it, is if you have too much return line treatment and everything, that will cause tons of carryover in the boiler. And the only way to do it is to flush the system. And if you are flushing the system by having to bring all the condensate back to your feed water tank, drain the feed water tank, and then fill the feed water tank, and then turn on the boiler again and everything, that takes a lot of time versus being able to fill the feed water tank with fresh water and then being able to valve off your condensate from your feed water tank and be able to waste it to drain. So I would highly recommend that if you have a contaminated system or if you are installing a system, to be able to valve off the condensate. I'll tell you a story. I got called out one time when I was a service technician. This company manufacturer, they couldn't keep these boilers running. They had 2 boilers, and they would say that the boiler would start, everything's running fine, and the boiler water level was there, and the boiler would ramp to high fire because there was 0 steam pressure, and all of a sudden the water level would just disappear out of the sight glass of the boiler, and then the boiler would go down in low water, and they would just sit there, their operators would just sit there and just keep hitting the reset of the boiler. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I looked around, always use context clues. Once again, when we are solving problems in the boiler room, we're not picking up tools and diving right into the system. We're going to be looking around, looking for context clues, looking for what changed, what is happening that is not normal, or what should be happening that is not happening. And I looked, and over against the wall, I see a pump plugged in and a 15-gallon tank completely empty of condensate or return line treatment. And I unplugged the pump because the pump was manually plugged into the outlet. I said, hey, is this new? What'd you guys do here? And they said, oh, yeah, we accidentally pumped in, I think they said 12 gallons of return line treatment. We needed more, and we were really low, so we put it on manual. We manually plugged it in, and of course the operators walked away, and they ended up pumping in all 12 gallons. What happens when you have that much return line treatment? There was so much foam in the boiler, but when I was draining it, luckily they had a way to isolate the condensate from the feed water tank. So I isolated the condensate from the feed water tank, and I was running it to drain, and it was foaming coming out of the drain, and it was just bubbling everywhere. And they were like, oh, is this really the fix? I was like, yes. And so I would just be running the boilers on low fire. Typically, you can get the boilers to run on low fire because the water level is going to be a little bit steadier. The boil is not as intense and is not going to be bouncing as much, and it'll keep the boiler on. So I locked the boilers in low fire and just sat there for a couple hours, continually flushing, and eventually I flushed out all the return line treatment out of the system that I needed to. It stopped bubbling out of the drain that I was observing the wastewater going into, and then I let the boilers go to high fire, and the water level was steady, and they didn't have any issues. Same thing will happen with oil. If you leave oil in the boiler and you don't do a proper boil out, is the water level will bounce up and down, and sometimes you can get away with it and just have a little bit of oil, but you are gonna be asking for issues, and I'm always on the side of to err on the side of correct and do the job correctly, because you want to make sure that you are starting up the boiler correctly. You don't want to have to be going back for callbacks. Say you start up a boiler and then some other technician has to go out there and the water level is bouncing because you didn't do a good job on the boil out. Now that technician turns a service call that is under warranty into hey, we got to re-boil out your boiler. But then the customer's going to say, well, isn't this covered because I already paid for this? And, of course, you're going to eat all that cost typically, which is not good. We always want to be making money for our company and always making sure that our brand new boilers and systems are running right. And that is why you're listening to Boiler Wild, to get educated, to get better, and to invest in yourself. And then you can help others learn by pointing them to these episodes or teaching them what you learned when listening to these episodes. If you have any questions about Boil Out, I think I covered most of it. Once again, talk to your boiler manufacturer of the boiler. They typically will have the boil out procedure in their manual. If not, you can look up one online. Very, very important. Once again, I want to reiterate this. Boil out is not a time-based procedure. It is a results-based procedure. And you should always educate your customer what you are doing, and that a boiler startup doesn't involve just flipping on the burner switch and starting at the boiler. Another thing you need to keep in mind is your customer needs to be aware of how much water you're going to be wasting. If you are just constantly filling and draining the boiler, it's going to be a lot of water. And they will typically, if you are in a new construction site, they will typically say, hey, we're ready for the boiler, but they may not have all the drain system ready to go, and they may not be aware of how much water is going to be coming out of the drain or all that. So make sure that they are aware of that, and make sure that they are educated on what a boil out is going to look like, what a startup is going to look like. Give them a timeline, give them some details. They don't have to know everything in detail, but it is beyond the, hey, we're just going to come in and flip the switch and the boiler just turns on and runs. That is not a startup. So I want to thank you for listening to this episode. Once again, please rate this podcast 5 stars. I appreciate everybody who's rated it so far. Leave a comment if you want to ask me a question directly, or if you have a topic recommendation, you can email me, eric.johnson@boilerin.com, or you can DM me on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening, and stay wild.